Hello again, and welcome back. We are almost at the end of the marathon, aren't we?
Almost.
Almost. It's this series has taken a lot longer to film than I planned. Some of you may know my circumstances. During the process of me filming these, I've become a full-time carer and numerous other complications in my life. So we've kind of had to bust them and film them when and where we could, haven't we, love? But I really am grateful to Kenn. I mean, the first two of these were filmed with someone else, but I am so grateful to Kenn for actually filming the bulk of these with me and going through this journey of the Healing Light Tarot with me. And actually, it's been great, hasn't it? Because we've, I suppose, in a way, the significance for this deck for both of us, isn't it? Because we've worked together, and
yes,
we've got an Oracle deck, well, your Oracle deck, which I illustrated, coming out in February of 2024, haven't we?
Yeah, but it wouldn't really have happened if not for this.
Hadn't been for this, yeah.
Exactly.
So, which is actually, it's doubly special to be sharing this journey with you for that reason. And we will soon be embarking on some videos talking about our own deck as well, won't we? Which is great.
Yes, that's a whole new adventure.
Yeah. But in the meantime, let's finish off the major arcana for the Healing Light Tarot, and that will conclude our journey through all 78 cards. So, so we are starting today with the Devil. This is kind of where I got non-traditional again.
And yet I think there's something still traditional about it, in not necessarily in the direct composition, but you have a lot of those traditional devil elements, and yet you also have that sort of Lucifer Morningstar style devil, rather than the goat leg bullhorn, that sort of animalistic one. You can kind of, although you've got demons and little demons with trumpets and stuff, the main figure looks quite human, apart with the wings and the horns. But and I think that's a good reflection of really what the devil is in the tarot, which it is us. It's everything that's bad or vice-like, or all the things that we should or shouldn't do, that can drive us to distraction because we know we shouldn't do them, or we shouldn't act like that, but sometimes we just can't help it. And
I kind of wanted to show something a bit different in this card as well, because I mean, don't get me wrong, I love sort of traditional devil cards that kind of show that sense of entrapment through our own vices, and the fact that we can be trapped by our own dark side, seeing the figures on the card chained to the devil's block, and the devil sat on it, and that it's a very powerful image, and it actually says a lot about human nature. But I kind of wanted to emphasize something different, because one of the things in my own experience is actually being afraid to face my own dark aspects, and how that causes its own sense of entrapment, because you end up, when you won't face your own dark aspects, you don't accept them, you pretend they're not there, you try and act as if they're not there, yet they will always find their way through and actually inevitably do more damage than if you were actually coming face to face with them.
Yeah.
And I was kind of thinking about this, and again, this is a card that started out in the Oracle project, and my friend Craig and I, when we were talking about this, it wasn't a devil card originally. We kind of wanted to show this image of what happens when you don't face the truth. And very often how, if you're trying to hide from the truth, it just gets louder and louder and louder in your ears until you can't ignore it. So Craig had this concept of like demons blowing trumpets, blasting their trumpets sort of in the ears of this figure. But what I wanted to create was something really quite disjointed. This is actually, when you look, it's a figure of a human male with his hands over his ears. But when you look really closely,
there is so many other sort of things in there.
Disjointed. It's made up of disjointed, screaming faces.
Yeah.
And I actually have to, if you look very closely, anyone who has the Sun Tarot will recognize that this is my dear friend Brendan, who was the primary model for the Sun Tarot. And I did a whole, when I was doing the devil card for that, I did a whole photo session of getting Brendan, who was a life model at the time, to sort of scream at the camera, you know, to give me, and because I had all of these unused shots, and I thought, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. So that figure is kind of this awful, paranoid, disjointed, you know, figure, and which I wanted to kind of show the torment of what happens when we try and block out the truth, and ultimately how that in itself is a reflection of the archetype of the devil.
Exactly.
You know, it becomes an entrapment.
That's the thing, and I think with the traditional ones, you get like everybody sees the figures with the chains on, and they're quite loose, and it's all about them being able to just take them off and walk away. Whereas this has an element of us needing to face things, but there is that sort of side to it that sometimes, those voices, those turmoils, those conflicts are inescapable, unavoidable. But the more we fight against them, the worse things are. Sometimes you just have to say, okay, we know where we're standing with this one. If you start to work through them or to deal with them rather than ignore them or just pretend that they'll get better without actually having any work put into them, that's, I think, the devil's blowing the trumpets and the demons and all that all those figurative symbols are all just extensions of those things in ourselves. If we were more, again, harkening back to temperance and where we just left off in the last video, if we accept that and come from a place of sort of integrated balance, we can kind of not necessarily bypass the devil situations in our life, but they're not going to last as long as more often than not. They tend to last because we don't deal with them effectively enough.
Yeah. And it's, again, the interesting thing with this is once he plucks the courage up to turn around and face what he fears, it loses its potency. It's like the devil is a figure of darkness. The devil, you shine light on the devil, who will recoil, and this is the fear of what isn't faced. And it's interesting because I think you see that within traditional cards. One of the things I love about the weight card is that the male figure that's chained to the block in the weight card, it's got demon's horns and a tail, but his tail ends in a plume of fire, which, it reflects the lover's card, because you see the tree of life, which has got fruit of fire, and then the tree of knowledge, which has got physical fruit on it, and it's reflected on the devil card in that the male figure's tail is fire, but that represents his burning passions and lusts. The interesting thing is, if you look at the female figure's tail, it ends with a bunch of grapes, and her hand is reaching down towards it, and that's a symbol of narcissism, because she's almost like that figure is feeding on herself. So you see two different types of entrapment, actually explicitly, narcissism and, unbridled lust. Whereas, this just shows entrapment, but it just shows a different type of entrapment. This is the entrapment that happens when you don't face the truth. So I hope that people can kind of still use that card in a traditional way, but then see something different. This is only one of two cards, by the way, where the mandala is broken because of the disunity, through what he won't face. You can see the two spheres on either side, but they don't meet. They're separated by him. And it's only when he kind of turns around and faces the truth and moves out the way that those spheres will overlap.
Yeah, that's it. It's almost really straightforward when you think about it, but once you sort of factor in this, the human condition, all bets are off.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's my devil card. This was a fun one to do.
This is always a fun one to see how people do this in any deck. Is the Tower.
I've done several decks where I had beautiful gleaming sci-fi skyscrapers in my tower cards. The Quantum Tower was like that, the Sun Tower was like that, and I thought, I want something medieval. And I found this lovely antique etching online. I think it was it was a 17th century, etching or 17th or 18th century of this church tower. And I thought, yeah, scan that, turn it into negative, blast it apart, and put some falling figures. And it's just, again, I kind of put a lot of mayhem and chaos and texture in here. But I also took a lead from the Thoth Tarot, because one of the things I love about the Thoth is that if you look, the sort of all the lightning energy is emerging out of an eye in the corner, the divine eye.
Yeah.
And, the Golden Dawn implies that as well. So I thought, right, let's turn the mandala into the divine eye. And then that's where the lightning's coming from. So ironically, the lightning is coming from healing space. But then if you look at this card from two directions, if it's a card of liberation and breaking out of a prison, then the fact that the lightning is destroying that prison is a great thing. If this is an unhealthy artificial construct of our own that needs to fall, then again, the lightning is coming from a healing space. So nobody wants to face this card.
No, because the thing is the necessary change that this brings about isn't, on a very superficial level. This literally goes the whole way through. It's down to the foundations. Yeah. And I often see, when I've seen this in other readings for other people, especially people that have, repeat readings, it can often come up because then they're not quite learning the lesson of the tower, which is, they get everything falls apart and falls down to the foundations, and they just try to build the same thing again. And then it's like, but we know what happens, because you'll get to the same point and it'll all come crashing back down again, because it's not the right way to go. So, and I think that's the hardest thing is people, again, don't like to admit that they're doing something wrong, or that they, that maybe their ideal's not right. But unfortunately, especially like in this one, the divine eye, the hand of fate, whatever you want to call it, doesn't really care. You can build your house of cards as high as you like, but eventually, if it's not serving your highest good, then it'll just come down. Yeah. And I think it's sobering when you actually sit back and think, actually, I don't have to keep building it the same way. But what you need to ensure is that whatever you build is on firm foundation.
Yeah. I mean, something you might notice is I don't do things by half. My devils are sinister. My tower cards literally explode. My death cards are grisly, as are my 9 and my 10 of swords. And I'm actually completely unapologetic for that. One thing I really have a problem with some modern tarot, not all, is the dilution of these cards.
Yeah.
And there's a particular movement to dilute these cards, and sometimes they have their names changed, or it's like, it's kind of, I'm not one where everything has to be affirmatory. These dark archetypes to me are as important to healthy living as the lighter ones are. And once we start diluting them, I think we dilute them at our peril, because healthy, holistic living is always going to include the difficulties, the striving, the adversities, the pain, the grief. That's what life is about. So when people start diluting the death card, the tower card, the devil card, when they, judgment is another one. It's like, we need judgment. We really do need the concept of judgment in our lives. It's accountability. But when it gets reduced to renewal or rebirth, or death gets reduced to transformation, or, and I'm just thinking, no, these are uncomfortable.
Yeah.
But we need that uncomfortable. These are uncomfortable truths. And I think that's the case. That's the really key thing. They're truths.
Yeah. And that's often the hardest thing, isn't it? It's accepting the truth. And, I think that, like you mentioned, with some avenues of thought and things these days, there is this tendency to over sweeten everything, but it just but in its own way, this over sweetened, over lightened thing becomes even more toxic than what people think that a
It is.
dark aspect could have.
Yeah.
And it's, and like I say, it all really boils down to balance
Interesting.
and integration.
You just made me realise something, because actually it's another form of this, isn't it? Blocking out the truth.
Yeah.
Let's just pretend that none of this dark stuff exists, and let's pretend that we don't have to face it in our own lives. Let's make the Nine of Swords cuddly. Let's make death cuddly. Just, it's not going to happen, is it?
No.
And and it's kind of crazy, because there's so much. Okay, there's darkness and there's sadness and there's torment and there's grief in the tarot, but there's also incredible sublime light and hope. To me, you don't need to dilute the dark bits, because they're realistic and they are more than.
That is the point, though, isn't it? It's realism, because it's life, and we all go through those things, regardless of whether we enjoy. Nobody enjoys the bad things, but
no,
that it is just part of life. It's part of being human, and if we cut that out, we're not living a balanced and great life. We are projecting a false positive. That we're constantly happy, constantly positive. Whereas actually, that's not what life is about. That's not how we live.
No.
But I think, especially with things like social media and all that kind of stuff, there's this horrible tacky veneer of light positivity over everything, but then in some extremes, everything's all doom and gloom and dark edginess and stuff.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, we can't exist in the extremes. We need to come meet in the middle.
There's got to be a balance of both. There has to be middle space. And I suppose if the Healing Light Tarot is about anything, it's about that middle liminal space.
Exactly. Yeah.
Where opposites are reconciled. That's what the mandala is. I mean, that's one thing. I will just give a shout out here to my friend Petronella Devaney. Now, if it wasn't for her, this deck wouldn't exist, because Penny and I co-produced what turned out was my first tarot workshop in 2015. And we did a one-day workshop called Sacred Tarot, which we ran in London very successfully. And the original idea, I mean, I've talked about this earlier on in these videos, was for Penny and I to collaborate on a deck based around the mandala. But the collaboration didn't work. But she actually very graciously just let me go my own way with it, and I started creating digitally, and it's what became the Healing Light Tarot. So, I have Penny to thank for actually introducing me to this concept in the first place. And, this deck is a testament to her as well. But on that note, let's move on to we'll go from the supremely dark to the next gloriously light.
The Tarot, the Star.
I love doing this card.
I really like this interpretation of it as well. I think there's just, again, it's one of those cards that that probably are some negatives to it.
Yeah.
But generally, if it pops out in a reading, you kind of like, oh, great. Especially, if it's a reading that's all swords and stuff. If something like this pops out, you go, oh, we can take a breath when we get there.
I'm part traditional and part modern in this. I mean, I've kind of stuck with the central star surrounded by the 7 smaller stars, which that's a motif that I love. It's a motif that goes right back to a lot of the, to the earliest Marseille decks. But I've kind of done something different with the Star Maiden herself. I've shown the pool, but what I wanted to show was the pool, as I wanted to emphasize it as liminal space. So much as the Healing Light Tarot is about liminal space, dusk and dawn, the mandala, I also wanted to show that liminal space between land and water. So she's actually on the land, but she is, rather than pouring water on land and sea, I love this. This is a wish card for me. So I wanted her to be sprinkling stardust. She's sprinkling stardust from one hand on the land and one hand onto the water.
Yeah.
You know, you can, and then you've got like what I call star rise. You know, over the mountains. You know, the star is rising. Interestingly, of course, I realized that these outer stars created a circle around the main inner star. So what I've done, it's the only card that shows like a continuous row of mandalas, you know. But the stars are the healing, you know. That's
there is always a good sort of sense of hope and like you say, wish fulfillment and things that come through with this card. I often see it as well as a very spiritual card as well. It deals with, you know, if you look at things like, you know, if you take the Hierophant, for instance, you know, at face value, all that staunch, stuffy, you know, rules and regulations, there's something so freeing, especially spiritually speaking, about the star. And it is one of those ones that has a great sense of, there's a sense of peace with it, but there's also a sense of action. It's not a card of you know, nothing happening.
No,
but it is. I think it is about stepping up for yourself in a way. You know, the freedom only comes if you move away from, you know, things like the Tower and the Devil that we've just literally gone through. You know, you have to physically keep moving away from those, and you know, and look for light. And I think, you know, the next three cards in this sequence, obviously, you know, the Star, the Moon, the Sun, they're all light, you know, light bearing cards, and they all have different nuances to how to find that light and where to, you know, where that light can be tapped into. And I think of all of them, I mean, some people might disagree. I think the Star's light is probably the purest.
Yeah, I think so.
I mean, some people would probably intrinsically go with the Sun, but I often see that the Star is the purest.
To me, this really is the wish card. This is the aspiration card. You know, if this turns up in a reading, to me, I just look at this and it just immediately says, you can do this. You know, you've got the potential. You know, and also as well, it's that thing that I'm a firm believer that the pool on this card is the same pool that we see on the Moon card. We're just on a different shore. But you see, that to me is it's the ocean of the unconscious. So the Star Maiden is actually sprinkling nourishment, nurture, you know, hope into the waters of the unconscious and also onto the ground of the conscious, you know. And it's just such a joyful, beautiful, beautiful card. It's one of my three favorites. I mean, I've said earlier on in these videos, whenever I get a new tarot deck, I immediately rummage through for the Star, the Moon, and the Sun. They are my ultimate three favorite cards, and they give endless possibility to an artist, you know. So I had the most fun doing this card. I loved it because I knew what I wanted to say, and again, I was it didn't turn out how it looked in my head. But what did come out was I just looked at it, got it, you know. And I love her. She's just such a figure of hope. You know, I took my lead from one of my tarot heroes, from Ciro Marchetti, because I love in a couple of his decks where he shows his Star Maidens with pictures, but they're actually emptying stardust out of the pictures rather than water. And I thought, let's have her sprinkling stardust in the same way. And also, it's because of the association with Aquarius. I love that kind of paradox that Aquarius is a water bearer, but is an air sign on the zodiac. So I've kind of put a lot of ambiguity here. We've got the water, we've got clouds, but when you actually look at the clouds are actually just a mirroring of waves.
Yeah.
So I just kind of wanted the sky. I took my inspiration from one of my favorite fantasy novels is C.S. Lewis's Perelandra. And it's set on a fictitious version of Venus. And there's one point where the hero is actually looking up at the dome of the sky, and the oceans of Venus are reflected on the dome of the sky because it's completely cloudy. You can't see through to space.
No, that's true. Yeah.
And it's this incredible. He talks about. I mean, C.S. Lewis was always incredibly poetic, and he talks about the goddess viewing herself in a celestial mirror. And I thought, yeah, this is the goddess. So there's a lot of my favorite things went into that card. And I think that's why I love it so much. So let's move on to the other shore.
Yes, to the moon.
Yeah. I've not done much different there. It's a little bit more surreal, but it's most of the traditional elements are in there.
Yeah.
I've got the mandorla rising between the two towers because to me, that is the pathway. The moon is drawing the crayfish up through the waters and along, and it will follow the path between the two towers. Almost as if it's like a moth to a flame. It's rising towards the moon, and that pathway from subconscious to deeply buried instinct to subconscious to conscious. To me, this is the process of us of facing our fears, facing our dark side, and actually integrating it. The dog and the wolf howling at the full moon. The full moon with its intimations of lunacy, and we know that the full moon does affect the animal kingdom. I used to work for London Underground, and we were actually warned in training to expect higher instances of bad behaviour and dangerous behaviour on full moons. And it was true. If you've got idiots doing silly things that would put themselves at risk on the station, it was more likely to happen on full moon night. But yeah, it's again the towers. Ironically, that's the same tower that I used on the Five of Cups, but it just felt right. I love. There's little mirrorings because I love in the Waite Smith deck. If you look closely, the towers on the moon. If you look on the death card, you actually see exactly the same towers, but from a long distance away, and from the other side of a river valley. And it kind of that little reminder that all of these scenes that we see in the tarot are all part of the same world.
Yeah.
And as a tarot artist, it's kind of your responsibility to create that world and make it coherent.
Yeah. One thing that I find with the moon that often a lot of people overlook, because a lot of people like to just focus on, especially some of the traditional meanings of it, about being fear and unknown things. But I often see it as that it can have elements of perspective as well, because you look out your window at your garden, say for instance, in the daytime, and then look out again in the moonlight.
Right.
It's the same thing, but it looks different. And
in a different light.
Yeah, you may notice things that you didn't notice by the harsh light of the sun. Sometimes the moon illuminates more than the sun ever could.
Well, when you think the sun is direct light, the moon is reflected light. And it is that whole thing of reflection, isn't it? Which throws things into a completely different perspective.
Yeah.
And it's weird. It's weird. I hadn't thought about that, but you're right. Very often, the cold light of the moon can reveal more than the bright, warm light of the sun. It's not as overpowering a light. Therefore, sometimes it allows us to see the details more in a more sharply etched way.
Yeah.
Again, I love this card. I will spend a lifetime tapping into the mystery of the moon card and never quite get there.
Well, the moon in general, civilization has been trying to tap into the mystery of the moon since we were looking up at the, first looking up at the sky and wondering what the hell it was. But, and I don't I think it's as much as science kind of demystifies a certain element of it, those intrinsic mythological, aspects of early civilization and stuff still remain. They still, people talk about the man in the moon and, Lady Lunar and all that kind of stuff. It's all ingrained in us. And I don't think that will ever change. Even, whether you believe it or not, we supposedly have gone to the moon, but it hasn't demystified it really to the that vast majority of us.
And nor should it, because it's the same. Our response to the moon is a very primordial thing. We know that it actually affects the water in our bodies. Its influence is strong enough; it can drag the waters up into tides. So regardless of what people say, we have an intimate relationship with this body, and nor should it change just because we've been to it. But then I'm a firm believer that astrology will never disappear for the same reasons. The science and the mysticism can, as far as I'm concerned, can coexist very happily together. Because they're not, to me, they're not fighting each other. They can coexist for very good reasons. And our sort of relationship with astrology is very similar to our relationship with nearer celestial bodies to the moon. We recognize that these bodies do have some kind of primordial influence over us. And, when those beliefs and when those systems were formulated, that's all we knew. Now we have the other side to add to that story and to make it more detailed. But it should never diminish what's gone before.
Of course not.
And the myths and the legends are just so much part of its beauty. So
the
sun. Again, this was another one that started out as part of an Oracle deck project, and then I took elements of it and I added to it and expanded it. I love the idea of the sun as a goddess and not just as a god. I mean, don't get me wrong. Lots of my favorite sun cards are based around the concept of the sun as a god, and particularly as Apollo. I think of the Mythic Tarot. Robert Place's incredible Tarot of the Sevenfold Mystery, which is one of my favorites, shows Apollo. But I was always struck. I'm a big fan of a BBC Radio 4 vintage sci-fi serial from the late 70s, early 80s called Earthsearch. And there's this lovely episode in Earthsearch called The Pools of Time, where they're sort of going back into prehistory. And they're talking about the formation of the solar system. And they're talking about the planets as beautiful children of the sun orbiting obediently around their mother. And I kind of thought, because I mean, all of the matter from the solar system has been ejected from our star, or is orbiting our star. So the sun as a god is very valid because of its powerful masculine, raw energy. But then as a mother as well, the force that we all orbit around. So I created a sun goddess, and she's enthroned. Her halo is the disk of the sun. You can see temple columns. I kind of wanted that kind of Mount Olympus feel. Again, that originally came from the Oracle project that was abandoned, but I just thought I've got to keep that because it's. And then what I did was I've kind of got the twins in there, but they're reaching out, and there's an albatross in here because I mean the albatross, it kind of has divine connotations. It flies high, it has the longest wingspan, and also I think it's a symbol. Is it a symbol of eternity or something like that?
Probably. They are quite, aren't they? They are quite long-lived, aren't they?
Yeah.
And they kind of pretty much live on the wing. They don't think they land very often, don't
That's
they?
right. So I mean, my twins are in a sunflower garden, but then you can also see the orbit of the planets around the goddess.
Yeah.
So it's kind of really quite celestial. And I kind of wanted to show her as part of that wider solar system. But then the twins are within the mandala. She emerges out of the healing space of the mandala because, I mean, as a healing mother, it's almost like she, I see the solar system as the safe home. And, she keeps her children within her orbit. But again, joy, happiness, raw power, bright sunlight. But then do that, you get too close, you burn. You stay too long, you burn.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about again our solar system, we are in that lucky zone. We're not too far away, we're not too close, and that seems to be part of the key, to everything here on this planet. And like you say, but if you get too close, you'll burn up, and if you go too far away, everything will freeze and disappear. It's so, like you say, it's about. I suppose in a way it could be seen as a card of boundaries.
Yeah,
strangely enough, if you think about it that way, don't stray too far or near to it. For the optimal conditions for a relationship.
When you think as well, I mean, joy I mean, this is a metaphor for joy, this card, and well-being and happiness. But actually, even if joy is too intense, it can be overpowering.
Yeah.
You know, it's, you know, when you see, you know, sort of people, you know, in these, you know, in cults where they go into these almost like states of rapture, you know, they then end up passing out, because it's actually sometimes too much joy is not a good thing.
Yeah.
You know, and that to me is the sort of potential burning power of the sun. You know, the sun can wither crops as well as nurture them.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, she is a wild energy. And I mean, I love it whenever she appears in a reading, because there's a positivity. But then, you know, there is also the potential for, you know,
Yeah.
too much.
You don't really want Icarus syndrome, really, do you?
Exactly. And again, that myth totally encapsulates it, doesn't it? Fly too close to the sun and you will lose your wings.
Exactly.
You know?
Yeah.
So yeah.
It's a nice card. I like the you know, the complete, well, not complete departure from the original, but it just, as far as interpretations of original cards, I think this one is one that is, I think, could go up there with a lot of other, you know, standout cards from other decks, because, like you say, you've interpreted everything that the Sun card represents, plus all these like extra things that probably people haven't even thought about, and you've twisted the, you know, the gender norm roles and everything else on its head, which again is not, you know, it's not completely unheard of in actual mythology and stuff. You know, the Norse god Sunna is a goddess of the sun, and they had a god of the moon, Mani. So, you know, as much as certainly Western culture sees, you know, the sun as masculine and the moon as feminine, you know, by and large, I think you tap into something again that sort of balances those things by changing the you know, the genders of,
and sometimes both principles can coexist. You know, they're both true. You know, I mean, interestingly, with this, it didn't start out as a Sun card. The basic image was one that I salvaged from the, you know, the unfinished Oracle deck. It was originally, when we created this figure, she was more to do, you know, she was actually created as a figure of, you know, sort of fame and maybe narcissism. But actually, when I looked at her, I thought, yeah, she's my son. And she said something very different, you know? So it's interesting how you can, project to project, you can create similar images, but with completely different meanings, depending on the context that they used within. And of course, it was only when I added the more traditional elements to this that it kind of became a Sun, you know, started to become a Sun card, you know?
Yeah.
But again, it's one of my favorites because, well, the Sun is always one of my favorite cards. I think probably my favorite in the whole deck, if I'm honest. But again, I was just really happy with what we managed to achieve here. So let's do another one of my unvarnished cards. I really hate it when this gets diluted. Judgment.
Dun, dun, dun.
And I love, I mean, it's funny. I previously come from an evangelical Christian background, which I left behind a long time ago. So you would think that I wouldn't particularly want to use Judeo-Christian imagery in my decks, but actually it kind of says it all, as far as I'm concerned, in a way that not much else could do. And that's why the imagery has stuck around for so long. You know, there is this powerful myth that, you know, the judgment angel will appear and the trumpet will blast, and, you know, the whole of humanity will be called to account, you know, before the final coming of God. But that's actually a powerful principle, that holding to account principle. You know, I love this card. This is when we wake up. This is when we have to take responsibility for our actions. This is when, you know, we can't get away with irresponsibility. And that's just a powerful principle in everyday life. So, you know, the fiery angel sitting in the sun, blasting the trumpet, you know, I thought, yeah, let's make that as fiery and as blazy as possible. Because this is daunting, and I wanted it to look daunting.
And I think the notion of it, especially, is quite pertinent. More nowadays, lately than for a lot of reasons. And I think it is this human arrogance that we can get away with anything, without consequence. That actually, sometimes the sobering reality is eventually the bubble will burst, and we will have to answer to whatever. And I mean, even going as far as what you can see in the figures is they're not all sort of crazy, sort of nicey kinds. It's it's almost a bit sort of, well, I suppose, it kind of almost goes back onto that sort of fire and brimstone-esque energy. It is something to be afraid of necessarily, because unfortunately nobody's perfect.
Exactly.
We all have something that we are, I don't know, guilty of, or whether it's by, through actions or inaction. We will all have to face a judgment on some level somewhere, regardless of what your socio or political or religious beliefs are. There will come a point where something somewhere will have to form a judgment for us to be able to move on, really. And I think this really actually does sum that up.
It's like with the devil card as well, isn't it? I mean, once that person turns around and faces his fears, he becomes stronger. And I think actually the whole message of the judgment card is when we actually own our actions and take responsibility, we become stronger.
Yeah.
Because the other thing is, this is, the myth of the last judgment is not just about judgment. It's also about being raised to a new life, And I think that it is a very, very powerful metaphor, because when we do take responsibility for our actions, we do kind of get raised up, because our behavior changes. We behave more responsibly. We behave with greater integrity. We learn from our mistakes. And that's what I love about this card. I mean, it's a real slap in the teeth when it appears, but it does talk about new life, and it talks about becoming a better version of ourselves and a higher version of ourselves. So again, I kind of make no apologies for, I don't think I made it loud enough, to be quite honest.
The trumpet's too small. It needs a bigger trumpet.
I'm a big admirer of Nigel Jackson's tarot artwork. He did the medieval enchantment, and he's recently done the Rose Tarot for Llewellyn. But it's like, if you look at any of Nigel Jackson's judgments cards, I mean, there's just fire all over the place. They are really uncompromising. But again, it's just one of those uncompromising cards of the tarot. It's one of the difficult lessons that we all benefit from. So there we go. Fiery Angel. And we are on to the last card. The World. Yeah. And this, believe it or not, was the first original card. I mean, obviously, I've shown you cards that were adapted from pre-existent projects, but this was the first fully original piece of artwork that I did for this deck. And I think it was only the second card. This and the Eight of Wands were the first two images that I did. But this started out in its most basic form as the promotional poster for mine and Penny's Sacred Tarot Workshop in 2014. I think it was 2014, 2015. And originally, the poster just had the tree with the mandala as a rising sun. And then I kind of realized when I was looking at it that my world card was almost there, because I just immediately thought, that's the world tree. And so this is part traditional, part not. I've got the traditional world dancer with the wands. But I thought, I want the world dancer triumphantly dancing on top of the world tree and within a sort of mandala sunrise. So again, it's very liminal space. This is the threshold between night and day. You traditionally see the mandala wreath on the world card, but I thought, let's do it in a different way here. So
yeah, definitely. Again, it's a departure from what people would, might instantly recognize outside of obviously the little one bearing figure. But like you say, there is this sense of completion. There is a sense of achievement and triumph.
yeah,
But again, like we've said before about all of the cards, it isn't a case of it being a cut-off standalone point. There is, as we know with the the majors, that after this we go back to the Fool again, and we start a new cycle. It's not that we're repeating the same thing, but
no.
Once we've completed one phase or aspect of life or a situation, then we move on to the next, but we still almost have to go through the same. We have to start it, we have to figure it out, find out how we can do things, learn lessons, all that kind of. So it's all the same cycles, just applied to the different aspects of life as we go along.
There's actually a precedent for it in the universe that we don't actually see on a day-to-day level, because we think of the planets orbiting the sun in a circle. So we think that we come back to the same point, whereas actually we don't, because the sun is orbiting the center of the galaxy. So as we on Earth orbit around the sun, we're not creating a circle, we're creating a spiral.
Yes.
So you might come back to the same degree, you might come back to degree 0, but you're further along. And I think in the case of the world, you come back to the place of the Fool, but you're on a higher level. So you're starting, you're sort of going upwards all the time rather than going round in circles. And I think that's the key to the world. The world will give way to the Fool, but the Fool who has been elevated, And
I suppose if you think about your Fool as well, or any Fool really, because they are all up on that cliff, it's almost taking that leap off where that elevated stage and going into the unknown again. And I think also the good thing about again, I think that a lot of people overlook with the world is this huge sense of completion. Sometimes people are a bit too quick to go straight into Fool mode and go on to the next thing. And sometimes this is about actually taking stock and just, patting yourself on the back and going, actually, do you know what? I've bloody done something amazing.
It's about sitting in the healing space.
Yeah.
And, enjoying the healing space. Because as you say, it's very often it's about achievement,
Yeah. And it's so easily overlooked in these days that people just, they don't get to take stock before they're headlong into the next thing. And then they wonder why sometimes they get bogged down in some of the other, card life lessons, because they've not actually took, if they'd taken a bit more precaution and a bit more time to appreciate what they've achieved, then they wouldn't necessarily fall into either the same or similar pitfalls all the time, because that you achieved something, but this was difficult, that caused an obstacle, so let's look at how we can avoid that the next time. And I think this is quite a sobering reminder, just to, like you say, just to exist in that space, to take a breath, sometimes maybe for a few days, just take it as a day as it comes, not trying to constantly live in the future all the time.
I think particularly with this, because with the mandala being, a mandala sun, it's actually basking in the warmth of that space, and she's raising the wands in triumph. This is really, this is the thing that I think a lot of people miss is, male, female, hermaphrodite, the figure on the world is a dancer, and it's a dance of sheer joy, a dance of triumph. And that's, as you say, that's not something to be rushed away from straight away.
No.
So we've completed the deck. I hope I've just so enjoyed doing this with you, and I hope everyone who's watching has kind of enjoyed this as much as we have putting it together. Actually, let's just talk about the back design before we go, because that just wraps everything up, doesn't it? The card backs just sum up everything about this deck. I actually took the The background is the waves and the clouds from the star card. And we've got a star of hope in the center of a mandala. So to me, this is all about the waters of healing, healing space, the space between light and dark, liminal space. But I wanted the backs of the cards to sum up everything about the deck. And this is, it is the Healing Light Tarot. It is hopefully a deck that will be a tool for healing and understanding. That's what it was created for. So there we have it. Darling, thank you. Thank you so much for being my guide and inquisitor through all of this. And to everyone who's watched, I hope you found these videos helpful, and I hope that they've given you a new appreciation of the deck if you bought it and if if you're working with it. But thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.